Well, I'm here with award-winning author John Everson, whose works include Sacrifice, one of the most twisted and disturbing novels I've ever read. And coming from me, John, that is high praise indeed. Welcome to Psychobabble.
Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. Now this book, Sacrifice, the story revolves around someone who is conducting ritualistic human sacrifices in order to form an alliance with sort of an army of malevolent spirits known as the Kerburide?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. They're sort of succubi demons who she hopes to bring through to our realm.
Okay. And what inspired this?
Well, a lot of things. I mean, the backstory to Sacrifice actually came out of Covenant, which was my first novel.
Okay.
You don't need to have read that to enjoy Sacrifice, with some of the backstories in there. And basically, the Kerburide were a bunch of demons that another demon had been sort of hired to keep out of our universe. Mm-hmm. And so now in Sacrifice we've got another woman who has found out how to bring them through, and her whole thing with bringing them through is to lure men to hotel rooms, knock them off, and if she completes a circuit of sacrifice, erotic, horrible, the worst sacrifices, nastiest stuff you can imagine, she'll be successful and she'll be the queen.
Erotic and horrible, that describes it. I will say this is not for young children. It is somewhat sexual in nature, but also the depictions, you go into great detail on some of the murders, very grisly, very very graphic. What sort of frame of mind were you in when you wrote that?
You know, it's funny because I wrote short horror fiction for years and years and years before attacking novels, and when you're doing that you kind of go, well, a lot of times you go for sharp shock stuff. Mm-hmm. And so to keep it up over a long haul of a novel, I suppose some of the stuff got probably more intense than anything I'd written before, simply by nature of writing in the long form. I really wanted to make it an intense ride.
It works. It's working. That's one thing I've noticed. I've read some other subpar horror novels where they get the blood and the gore and the guts right, but they're kind of lacking in other departments like plot lines and character development and stuff like that. You seem to be strong on all fronts. What's your writing background?
Well, I started out as a journalist, which is probably part of the reason the lead character of Sacrifice is a journalist. Mm-hmm. He's a reporter patterned after a little bit of myself, I suppose. So I worked for local newspapers, Star newspapers, Southtown Economist. I had a couple of things in the Chicago Tribune at one point. So I did a lot of news writing, was a journalism major from University of Illinois. And I wrote short fiction for most of the 90s, dozens and dozens of short stories.
Well, and as you mentioned, Sacrifice is a continuation of the story begun in Covenant. But I did not read Covenant, and I will say Sacrifice stands alone on its own. You don't need to have read Covenant to follow the story. But if people want to start at the beginning, they would go back to Covenant.
Right. And Covenant is basically, the reporter in Sacrifice, his name's Joe. Covenant is Joe's story at the start, where he goes to a small town trying to get away from big city journalism, and hears about a suicide off the cliff outside of town. He wants to go cover it for the newspaper, and his boss is like, nah, sit it out, which he thinks is weird since nothing happens in this town but bake sales. So he starts looking into it. Pretty soon he finds out there's been a suicide off this cliff on the same date every year for 100 years. Maybe it's not suicide.
All right.
And if it's a serial killer, the guy'd be really old. So Covenant is basically Joe looking into that, trying to figure out what's going on in this town, and it all revolves around a cliff. Covenant's sort of a very claustrophobic mystery to horror novel, as he uncovers the deep mystery, which deals somewhat with the Kerburide, and will play into the backstory of Sacrifice, as you know, but you don't need to read both.
So is there going to be a third part of this?
Everyone who's read Sacrifice has already asked, where's the sequel?
Right, exactly.
I would like to. It is not in the cards currently. My publisher wanted me to go out and do a couple of standalone novels to establish myself more, and not just a series author. So actually this month, my next novel, the third one called The 13th, is out. It'll be in stores in a week or two. That's a standalone novel, and I just turned in Siren, which is more, it gets away from sort of the erotic ritual sacrifice demonic stuff, and plays with a real siren, mythological siren in the modern age.
Nice. Catch it. Catch the 13th. Covenant, Sacrifice, John Everson. Check him out.